Hey everyone, remember Y2K? Back when we thought all the computers would crash at midnight on January 1st, 2000.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you guys sent in some really interesting articles about how that same era is making a huge comeback in pop culture.
Hmm.
It's crazy. People are wearing low-rise jeans again.
Really?
Yeah. Flip phones are back in style.
Wow.
And Spotify is full of playlists from the early 2000s. So today we're going to take a deep dive into this whole Y2K thing. Why are we so obsessed with a time that was full of tech panic and some questionable fashion choices?
You know what's really striking? The contrast between how scared we were of the Y2K bug and how we look back on it now. It's almost like we're choosing to just remember the butterfly clips.
Yeah.
And forget about the potential for global chaos.
Totally. Governments were spending billions of dollars trying to avoid a digital meltdown. And some people were even prepping for, like, a full-on apocalypse.
Right.
And the funny thing is, when the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, pretty much everything kept working.
Yeah, I know.
There were a few little glitches, but nothing major happened. The massive catastrophe everyone was afraid of never actually happened.
No, it didn't.
But even though Y2K fizzled out, it was a big turning point. It was the beginning of the internet as we know it today. Things like MySpace, online forums where anyone could share their thoughts, and even movies like You've Got Mail.
Oh, You've Got Mail is such a perfect snapshot of that time.
Right.
It's so interesting to see how that era, with its dial-up internet and pixelated graphics, became the foundation for the hyper-connected world we live in now.
And now we have Gen Z, who weren't even around for the original Y2K, leading this 2000s revival. They're bringing back everything from juicy couture tracksuits to those chunky highlights.
Oh, yeah.
The ones we all tried to forget about.
It seems like there's a real desire for what people see as a simpler, more carefree time. Maybe Gen Z sees the 2000s as a pre-9/11 world, a time before the constant worries of social media and the 24/7 news cycle.
I hear you, but simpler times. I'm not so sure about that. Let's not forget the downsides of the early 2000s. The internet back then was like the Wild West. Cyberbullying was rampant on sites like MySpace. Paparazzi were constantly hounding celebrities, and magazines were pushing these unrealistic beauty standards
Right.
that caused a lot of people to have body image issues.
You're absolutely right. We need to acknowledge those less glamorous parts of the 2000s. And here's where things get even more interesting. This yearning for a simpler time is partly driven by the same algorithms that contribute to the information overload and burnout we feel today. We're basically chasing a romanticized version of the past while being pushed by the very things that make our present feel overwhelming.
It's like we're nostalgic for an era that, in a lot of ways, created the digital anxieties we're trying to escape from.
Yeah,
But even beyond the social scene, the early 2000s internet itself was totally different from what we have now. It
absolutely.
was a whole different beast.
It was a time of just pure chaotic creativity. Remember Flash animations?
Oh, yeah.
Those clunky, weird creations were everywhere. And then there was Napster, which basically made music piracy mainstream. Online forums were full of what we used to call random humor, basically the early version of today's meme culture.
And it was during this crazy time that corporations realized the power of the internet. They started figuring out how to turn that random humor into profits.
This is where we saw the birth of viral trends as we know them today. And the impact of that Y2K era digital explosion is still very much with us.
Yeah, it's wild to think those early, sometimes ridiculous parts of the internet actually shaped how we get and share information today. We're still dealing with the fallout from that whole Y2K digital explosion, both the good and the bad.
It's true. Think about it. The internet in the early 2000s, with all that random humor and viral trends, it kind of trained us to consume information in these little easy-to-digest pieces. And I think this constant stream of information has probably shortened our attention spans, making it harder to really engage with complex stuff or form our own opinions.
Yeah, and that shorter attention span has definitely played a part in the rise of misinformation and fake news. It's harder than ever to tell what's true and what's not when we're constantly bombarded with so much content, especially when a lot of it is designed to grab our attention for, like, 5 seconds.
Exactly. And then there's that whole doom scrolling thing, endlessly scrolling through negative news and social media. Even though it makes us feel anxious and drained, it's become almost like a reflex in this hyper-connected world.
Like it's a habit we can't break.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know, a good example of how the early internet shaped how we interact with information is TikTok. Those short, often funny videos are super addictive, but they also focus more on quick entertainment than on really engaging with content.
Oh, that's a great example. TikTok is basically a descendant of those old, chaotic internet forums and Flash animation sites. It shows how the trends and technology of the past still influence the internet today.
It's almost like we live in a world ruled by irony now. Everything's turned into a meme. Every serious issue becomes a joke or a soundbite.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but also kind of unsettling.
It is. And this leads us to another big takeaway from this deep dive. Even though the Y2K bug didn't turn out to be a big deal, it accidentally set off a bunch of events that led us to this super interconnected but also fragile digital world, where we're overloaded with information and meme culture is just the norm.
It's scary to think that even though we avoided a technological disaster back in 2000, we might be even more vulnerable today. Back then, the consequences were serious, but imagine what would happen now in 2024. Everything's so much more complex and connected than it was 20 years ago.
Exactly. Imagine if a huge cyber attack or a software failure suddenly shut down all these important systems. We're talking about things like cryptocurrency markets collapsing, smart cities going dark because of blackouts, and global supply chains coming to a standstill. The effects would be felt everywhere.
It makes you wonder if we've learned anything from Y2K. Are we actually ready for the next big internet breakdown?
It's a good question to think about. We rely on technology way more than we did in 2000. It's almost like we're tempting fate by building all these complicated digital systems without really understanding what could happen if they fail.
Okay, so we've talked about the global panic, the fact that nothing really happened, the comeback of 2000s trends, and those scary what-if scenarios. But there's something else about Y2K that I've been thinking about.
What's that?
It's the huge cultural impact, especially when it comes to music. Think about Britney Spears and Baby One More Time. That song was a defining moment of the late 90s and early 2000s. It sold over 10 million physical copies.
Wow, that's incredible, especially when you compare it to the music scene today.
Right. These days, artists are practically bending over backwards just to get 10 million streams on Spotify.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much the music industry has changed, how we listen to and value music has been completely transformed.
It really shows a bigger cultural shift, not just in music, but in our whole relationship with fame and celebrity. Before social media, pop stars like Britney Spears had this mystique about them. There was a distance, a carefully created image that was controlled by record labels and the media. Now, that distance is pretty much gone thanks to Instagram, Twitter, and all that.
It's true. Back then, you had to wait for MTV to play your favorite music video or hope your local radio station would play your song. Now we have instant access to any song, any artist, anytime we want. It's all about curated playlists, algorithms deciding what you should listen to, and this constant need for instant gratification.
Yeah, and that shift goes way beyond just music. It reflects a bigger trend towards wanting everything right now, this need for instant gratification. Speaking of instant gratification and things we probably shouldn't want, can we talk about Clippy for a second?
Oh, Clippy. Microsoft's little virtual assistant, the animated paperclip that popped up at the worst possible times.
Oh, I remember Clippy.
It was like that well-meaning but super annoying friend who's always trying to help but just gets in the way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Clippy was, in a way, a very early version of the more advanced AI we have now, like ChatGPT.
Right. It was an early attempt to make AI that could predict what we needed and offer help. And while Clippy ultimately failed, it did kind of pave the way for developing more advanced and hopefully less annoying AI systems.
And yet here we are, all these years later, still struggling with the implications of AI, both the ethical stuff and the practical challenges of actually integrating these systems into our lives. Have we really learned from our past mistakes with technology, or are we just going to keep repeating them on a bigger, more technologically sophisticated scale? It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Yeah, it really is something to think about.
It makes you think about how much technology affects our lives, both back then and now. We're surrounded by Y2K stuff. It's in our fashion, our music, all over social media. It's easy to just focus on the fun, lighthearted side of it all.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally fine to enjoy those trends and reminisce about simpler times. But it's important to remember that nostalgia often makes things seem better than they actually were. We should look at this whole Y2K revival with a critical eye. We need to understand that it wasn't just about butterfly clips and catchy pop songs.
So you're saying we shouldn't just jump on the bandwagon without thinking about the bigger picture?
Right. The 2000s, just like any other decade, had its problems, both socially and technologically. And those problems didn't just vanish when 2001 rolled around. They've evolved, and in some cases, they've become even bigger issues in our digital world.
So we're still living with the legacy of Y2K even though we didn't have a digital apocalypse.
Exactly. We're dealing with the consequences of this rapidly changing digital landscape, a culture obsessed with irony and instant gratification. And there's this constant underlying worry about what's going to break next. The vulnerabilities that came to light during the Y2K scare haven't gone away. They've just become more complicated and intertwined.
Which brings us back to that scary question. Are we really ready for the next big internet crash? If the relatively simple systems of the Y2K era could potentially disrupt the whole world, what happens when the much more intricate and essential systems we rely on today get compromised?
It's a pretty sobering thought, and one that we need to think about seriously. We've put so much trust in technology, everything from financial markets to critical infrastructure, but what happens when that technology fails? The impact could be massive and really damaging.
So what can we do about it? Should we all become like tech doomsday preppers, stockpiling canned food and learning how to code?
I don't think we need to go that far, but we should definitely approach technology with a healthy dose of skepticism and be aware of its limitations. We need to understand that progress doesn't always move in a straight line, and that technology, despite all the good things it brings, can also create disruption and make us vulnerable.
I guess it comes down to finding a balance, enjoying the fun, nostalgic parts of the Y2K comeback, while also learning from the lessons of that time. We shouldn't repeat the same mistakes, especially as we're heading into an even more complex and interconnected digital future.
Yeah, I agree. The Y2K era is a powerful reminder that technology can be both good and bad. It has the power to connect us, empower us, and drive incredible innovation. But it can also isolate us, manipulate us, and create new weaknesses. It's up to us to shape how technology develops, to make sure we get the most out of it while minimizing the risks.
Well said. The Y2K era is a really interesting example of how technology can be a double-edged sword. Well, that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Y2K, the anxieties, the trends, the weird tech stuff, and the lasting impact it's had on our digital lives. We talked about the hysteria, the nostalgia, and those what-if scenarios that make this era so fascinating and thought-provoking. The Y2K bug may not have caused a digital meltdown, but it definitely left its mark on our world. So, next time you see a butterfly clip or hear a Britney Spears song, take a moment to think about what it really represents. The past might seem far away, but its influence is still very much alive in our digital age. Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those butterfly clips securely in place.